Hey everybody, this is Paul, and what I want to do in this video is give a response to Genetically Modified Skeptic's video, Why I Love Jesus But Won't Follow Him. Now, for the most part, I like Genetically Modified Skeptic stuff. It's definitely much more charitable and better than the standard New Atheist stuff that doesn't always show a lot of charity or desire to engage with arguments. In the beginning of this video, he goes around explaining why he could have chosen to make his video and content more clickbaity and morally outrageous, but he didn't choose to do this. Although, to be honest, this video does look very clickbaity from the icon. But I think it's an interesting video, and I wanted to go through the points that I thought were good and the points that I thought were not so good, and hopefully continue this conversation. Drew, if you're watching this, thank you, I guess, and I hope you think I'm being charitable and fair to your view. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. So, from what I understand, Drew gives three reasons why he's not a Christian. The first is that he thinks that Jesus attributes a lot of bad in the world to evil forces, and he doesn't agree with that. The second is that a claim that apocalypticism and post-death reward impede social progress. We'll get into that as well. And last but not least, this idea that associating yourself as a follower or with a specific identity can put narrative and identity above values. And that's an interesting point too. That's perhaps the most interesting point out of the whole video, and I think that's, there's not a really good answer to this, but we'll at least talk about it. The first is, does Jesus think evil forces are to blame? Yeah, I think Jesus does, and I think if your reason for not following Jesus is you don't believe in the supernatural, or you don't believe that there is such thing as evil, then that's, it'd be hard to call yourself a Christian if you don't believe evil exists. Now, whether you think evil is the result of human actions or human is the result of evil spirits, I think that's a different thing. There are some Christians who deny that demons exist, maybe even that the devil exists. I think that's even a real thing. But I do think Jesus did teach that people are responsible for their choices and they do have free will. Drew has this quote, he says in the video, wrongdoing comes from the corruption of one's own doing. And I would think Jesus would agree with this. And in fact, the whole story of the Bible teaches this, all the way from Genesis, that Jesus' death was the sort of thing that reconciled people into a right relationship with God, and that it was people's initial rebellion against God that caused all this problem in the first place. What I think is really interesting is that there are many naturalists who doubt free will. There's a post over on Naturalist, it's either naturalist.com or naturalist.org, that basically makes the argument that, hey, I don't know if we should still hold people accountable for their actions, because people being able to make free choices, like having this libertarian sort of free will, and whether or not you're a compatibilist, that's just a whole other can of worms. I don't want to go down for this video, but basically the idea is, does it require anything supernatural to believe that you have control over your own actions? Or is that sort of an illusion? That's even something that I think many people are skeptical of. And that'd be an interesting thing to be a skeptic about free will. If you're a skeptic about free will, I don't know if you can really be a Christian in the traditional sense, although I guess you can argue about Calvinists, but I don't know. I honestly don't know enough about Calvinism to really comment on that issue. Although I would argue we do need some mechanism about talking about this corruption that Drew refers to, and Christianity does have this positive hate the sin, not the sinner sort of thing. It's not that you're a result of your choices, it's that you are making these choices, and it's the choices that you're making that are bad and not you who is bad. It is you who are loved and infinitely valuable, and you are more than just your choices, are more than just what you can produce for other people. So I do think Christianity has that to offer, but of course, if you deny the existence of evil spirits or even the supernatural, I think you can't really call yourself a Christian. And he makes his claim, regardless of the mercy and forgiveness he displays, Jesus' teaching rests firmly upon this ignorant view, and I simply cannot follow a person who teaches it. Now, notice the use of this loaded word ignorant here. What we need to do is actually assume, we need to know whether or not this is true. Why assume that transcendent good and evil are ignorant things, or even like evil spirits? Claiming that they're ignorant, you need to give a reason why these are ignorant. And from what I understand, it's very difficult to sort of disprove this sort of thing. I mean, you can't just test whether or not good and evil exist. And even if you could, would that really constitute knowledge? I mean, it's a really interesting sort of thing. In order to make this claim, you need to be sure that you're actually making the claim and showing that it's true. And one of the tricky things is moral ontology and moral epistemology actually favor a supernatural basis. And I've made this point in a paper that I have, I'll link in the description. Getting a lot of mileage out of this paper. Please read it and give me feedback. Also, Alistair McIntyre's book, After Virtue, G.E.M. Mascombe's really influential paper from, I think, the 50s or 60s, Modern Moral Philosophy. But basically, they're making this argument that you can't have good and bad without this sort of supernatural teleology. And this is the claim that it's making. So I don't know if I think it's premature to claim that Jesus' teaching are ignorant without providing some other reason. And maybe Drew does have more reasons why he claims that it's ignorant. But on the surface, I don't think you can just make that claim. I mean, I would certainly challenge it and say, okay, why do you think this is ignorant? Why do you think this is no longer a thing? I mean, I definitely have written about this and why one of the reasons I think that to even be able to say things are right and wrong and be able to have moral discourse in the first place, you need to at least be open to the supernatural. But that's what the argument that I make in my paper. So read it if you want more. But basically, the point is that's a very controversial claim. The second point that Drew makes is that apocalypticism and post-death reward impede social progress. And I actually used to believe this too, but I no longer do, and I'll explain why. The first thing that Drew says is, or one of the things that he says is that he claims that Jesus taught he would return in the disciples' lifetime because he was this apocalyptic prophet. Now, that's actually a claim you should be very skeptical about. It's a very popular talking point about that Bart Ehrman makes, the biblical scholar, and a few other people, but there's not a lot of consensus around this point. I don't even think a majority of New Testament historians would even make this claim. Or maybe they would probably make the claim that Jesus' disciples thought he would return in his lifetime, or some of them did, but maybe not all of them. But basically, the point is this is not. You should be skeptical of this, right? There's not a critical consensus about this being true. Now, Bart Ehrman, I think, is a great scholar. I really do think he's a very good scholar, but I do think he sometimes exaggerates the case for some of the more skeptical elements. And I understand why I think he needs to do this, because he's pushing back against a lot of New Testament historians who are convinced that Christianity is true and may overstate the case for Christianity. So I think Ehrman doing this isn't even immoral or bad or even nefarious at all. I just think he is kind of making a claim to he's maybe thinking he wants to get more of a fair hearing. But this point in particular, I don't think we can pretend that this is the only interpretation of the evidence, and there are very solid arguments against this as well. The second thing that Drew talks about is he talks about Jesus not really condemning slavery and that being a wrong thing. And one of the things we need to mention is that slavery in Jesus' time was very different. This is not the chattel slavery that we're thinking about, where people of a certain race are being owned by someone else. Slavery in this Greco-Roman culture, people were often able to buy their own freedom. They were often freed once a debt was paid. There's a lot more going on historically. So when we think of the word slavery, we can't be thinking about slavery in the United States or race-based slavery when we're thinking about this slavery in the Old Testament. And furthermore, if Jesus is who he says he was, he had a much bigger agenda than just being a political revolutionary, than just reforming political systems. He was going after, if Christianity is true, he's going after people's hearts and their lives, and obviously things that are arguably way more important, if they're taken to be true, than just the political state of things. Now, of course, would you make the argument that focusing on those things comes at the expense of social progress? You could make that argument, but remember that it was Christianity that actually abolished slavery. It's the only culture to do it. It's the only religion to do it, and it did it twice. Makes you wonder, why didn't it go through the first time? Why did it have to do it twice? Interesting question. But this is the consensus among most historians, is that pretty much all historians that I know, that Christianity was the reason that slavery was abolished, and it was the culture that did it twice. And I can provide a reference if you need that among a couple among historians that I've read. Now, I think the thing that Drew says is he says that what Christianity breeds is that your highest priority shouldn't be improving this world, but gaining admission in the world to come. And notice here that this is a false dichotomy, right? That if you're not, that you can either choose to improve this world or gain admission in the world to come. What if it's the case that gaining admission in the world to come is proportional to your desire, or maybe in some ways your actions in this world? It doesn't necessarily need to be this. But I don't fault Drew for making this claim, because I think there are way too many Christian churches, well, any of them that do this, that put sort of too much emphasis on these theological aspects and not in the here and now. They get caught up in just preparing a place for themselves in the next world, and they ignore this one. This is a huge problem in evangelical Christianity, or in some evangelical circles. It's one that even evangelical historians and evangelicals themselves have written about. If you want to read more about this, look at Mark Noll's excellent book, Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, really fascinating book, who talks about this, who talks about we should be enjoying this world. This world's also a gift from God. So I think you can make the argument the other way around. Now, I would agree that there are way too many churches that do have this mentality, but there are also a great many churches that basically say we need to improve this world because this world is a gift from God and we're given stewardship of this and this. And I don't think you can basically make this wide sweeping claim that this is impeding social progress, because it kind of goes both ways. But my main contention with this is that it's categorically false that apocalypticism and post-death reward impede social progress. Explicitly religious individuals give more money to charity, and this includes secular charities. So you'd think they would have spent all their money on their religious institutions and have left less money to spend on secular charities, but they also give more to secular charities, including, in addition to giving more to religious charities, of course. They volunteer more of their time. They're more likely to donate blood, and they're significantly more likely to help a homeless person. So this idea that very religious people are somehow caught up in these religious matters and have less time or energy to think about, here and now matters just is not true. And the effect here, these effects are actually proportional to the degree of one's religious belief. So the more religious you are, actually the more time you donate, the more blood you donate, if you do the statistical analysis. So it's very interesting that this is the case. And here's from a book. Donald Trump voters who attend church regularly are more likely than non-religious Trump voters to have warm feeling towards racial and religious minorities, be more supportive of immigration and trade, and be more concerned about poverty. So this idea that religiosity is either the root of all evil or impedes evil, I think is just wrong. I think it's just blatantly wrong. And the evidence and the data suggests it. It's easy to construct a narrative that it could be wrong. Oh, we're spending all this time thinking, in church, praying, doing all this stuff, and not out there actually helping. But it actually seems to be the opposite, that it actually encourages this sort of pro-social practice. So kind of interesting. Now, the point that Drew makes about narrative and identity above all else is a really interesting point. That does it become the point where your narrative and your identity trump your own values? And the response I would have is, does any moral view or label create out-group hostility? Because one of the things that Drew says is that Christian practice often creates highly insulated groups in which unchecked tribalism gives rise to antisocial attitudes and behaviors towards outgroups. Now, I would agree with this statement. Actually, I don't think there's anything wrong with this, but I don't think there's any reason to think this is an issue that's precisely only with Christianity or with any religious practice. And this goes back to my other view. Doesn't any moral view or label create outgroup hostility? Wouldn't believing in humanism or believing in equality or these sorts of things become their own identity? Drew, he identifies himself as a skeptic. That's the label that he gives himself. Now, does that create outgroup hostility towards non-skeptics? I wonder if he would admit this. And I would wonder if he would also see this issue among hostility towards religious people in skeptic and atheist communities. Is this an issue that he sees? Is that by identifying as a skeptic, you are staking your identity and now you're sort of creating an us and a them and creating this sort of tribalism mentality? It's interesting. I'm curious. I'm really curious about this. If naturalism is true, right? If Christianity is false, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead or whatever, there wouldn't be anything about Christianity that makes it any more or less likely to create tribalism in itself. In fact, actually, I think you could go further and say, because Jesus speaks against tribalism, even if naturalism is true, even if Christianity was false, we would expect Christians to have less outgroup hostility than people who aren't Christians or people who have no explicit teaching on inclusion. Now, maybe you could make the argument there could be some group that believes in not having outgroup hostility, and maybe for them they would be less likely to create an us versus them mentality. But since that's a view that's baked into Christianity as well, I don't think it's a controversial claim to say that, yeah, any group has the potential to create outgroup hostility, have an us versus them whenever you define an us circle. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it or we shouldn't have any identity at all, because identity can give us, and narratives can give us a lot of value. And they can also give us an identity that's specifically tied to having positive feelings towards outgroups. That's something when I converted to Christianity, I noticed in myself as I started having way more positive feelings towards other minorities that before I didn't have a lot of patience and time for. And that's kind of my own personal thing of realizing, one of the reasons I identify as a Christian is it's a reminder to me of how I'd like to treat other people. it's a reminder to me by declaring that as my identity that I should treat other people this way. And I really do believe this, but not only do I believe it intellectually, but I need to go out there and put that into practice. And having that identity helps me to do this. And it's interesting, he makes the claim, I'm perfectly content to love Jesus because I love his morals, rather than following his morals because I first love Jesus. It's a really interesting quote. I'm not even critical of this at all. I think this is just a really interesting point. I don't know if it's easy to separate one or the other. You wonder, how did Jesus get a large following in the first place? Now, if you're a naturalist, you have to believe that Jesus never did any miracles, or maybe he was some sort of trickster or some sort of magician or something like this. So you could argue that they maybe followed him because of miracles, or you could argue that they followed him because of his morals. But I think maybe it's the case that some people follow Jesus first because of his teachings, and then they get into justifying them. And other people, they resonate more with the actual story and narrative of Jesus, and then learn to follow the teachings of Jesus once they've done this. So maybe there's not a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. But yeah, I just find it very, very, very interesting to do that, to make that claim. I don't necessarily disagree with it. I think it's maybe one and the other. You start by realizing that Jesus said all these good things, and you try living them out, and then you're like, okay, well, this is really solid stuff. Maybe some of the other things he talked about might have been true as well, and you start looking into it, and then you either become convinced like I did, or maybe you become more skeptical. I don't know. It's an interesting point. A few other notes I wanted to make that weren't really related to any of these 3 points. There's a video that Drew cited where basically he quotes somebody that says, the reason why Islam and Christianity spread throughout all of Africa was to exploit all the people. All Christians think like white Europeans. That's a very controversial claim. And even though this claim, I guess, was made by someone who was African, is that really what African Christians would say? Would they agree with this claim? I don't think so. I think they'd be very, very skeptical of this. In fact, I would encourage anyone who's listening to me right now, not just Drew, but anyone, to read Howard Thurman's book. It's sitting here on my desk because I need to return it to the library. I actually need to recheck it out. Jesus and the Disinherited. The reason I say this, and I'll probably post a review of this book, is I was thinking about this issue. How is it the case that so many African Americans are Christian given the problem of evil and slavery? And this is specifically prompted because there's a professor at my university who's a black humanist, and he's basically an atheist who's black, and the thing that convinced him of atheism was the problem of evil related to slavery. And I remember thinking, what are the Christian responses? What are black theologians saying in response to this? I mean, there's so many black Christians. They have to have thought about this and thought about, is it possible that God doesn't exist? So I talked to one of my pastors, and he recommended this book about this issue with the problem of evil, and he recommended a couple theologians, but this book really resonated with me, and I would encourage you all to read this, because he basically literally starts out in the book like when Howard Thurman went to, and he's the guy who Martin Luther King kept this book in his briefcase when he was going on all of the protests and things, and really advocating for nonviolent protesting. But basically, Howard Thurman, he went to India and was talking to some of the Indians there, and they literally went right up to him and asked him, like, how can you claim to believe in Jesus when it was the people that enslaved your people that claimed they were doing this for Jesus or believing in Jesus? And that's a claim that Howard Thurman addresses in his book, and you should just read it, because I would argue Howard Thurman is he's just fantastic. I mean, I'd say put him on like C.S. Lewis level. He's that good. I mean, he's really excellent. But anyway, that's a topic for another video. But anyway, there are responses to this, but to claim that all Christians think like white Europeans, I think it's disrespectful, honestly, because I don't think that's what African Christians would say. My girlfriend's roommate, she's from Nigeria, and she's Catholic, and we've had some really interesting discussions. So there's a lot more going on there. The other thing he says is we have no tangible evidence for another realm of existence. And I find that claim to be interesting, because I think this skepticism if we're being honest, should extend to morality too. If we're going to be skeptical about another supernatural realm of existence, that means we also need to be skeptical about morality itself. What reasons do we have to believe that things like slavery are wrong? Now, we can say, of course, slavery causes harm to certain people, but that's presupposing a very humanistic position. It's presupposing that human suffering is something that we ought, and notice that ought, that's a prescriptive claim, we ought to do something about, or we ought to care about. And I don't think naturalism, and I don't think skepticism has any way of addressing this question about why someone ought to put their own desires on hold to care about suffering, especially if they don't already do this. And that's what I find very ironic, is he abandons a theological position, he abandons Christianity in favor, and one of these reasons of not following Jesus is because Jesus isn't so explicit about slavery, which we've talked about, but he then embraces a skeptical one that denies the objective wrongness of slavery. And I think if you're going to be skeptical about the existence of God, which you can make a naturalistic argument for, right? You can say, okay, at least there's a cosmological argument that there's a creator, there's this and this and this, but making an argument for the existence of objective moral values that have the authority to supervene on our own behaviors and desires, that's a very controversial claim, because I don't think you could ever come to that from a naturalistic framework. And you can't come to that without ignoring, I think this is kind of very Heideggerian, but our own experience of being, right? That you can't come to that by just looking at humans. And I think maybe that's one of the fatal flaws that we see in, I'm gonna get a lot of shots for this, but in one of the social sciences, one of the problems is it ignores our experience of being. We don't have an understanding of psychology or our own consciousness. And as a result, all of these theories rest on these assumptions that don't take into account our own state of being, which I'm not saying, I do believe that slavery and these things are objectively wrong, right? But I don't know if you take a skeptical position for God, if you can also affirm the objective wrongness of slavery without that looking like special pleading. Like, okay, you don't think there's enough evidence to warrant belief in God, but somehow you think there's enough natural evidence to warrant belief that some things are objectively wrong. That's another claim. But once again, that's just a whole other issue, a whole other can of worms. Just my own, critique of that particular point. And then he does mention this, counting on someone or something else to solve our problems will only prolong our sufferings. And I'd agree with this, but notice that this isn't at odds with Christianity. And I think the type of Christianity that Drew's talking about is a type of Christianity that I would have severe issues with. It's just, I don't think that's representative of authentic Christianity. It's not representative of the Christianity that I ascribe to. To me, it feels like a very dead Christianity, a very dead faith. It's like, God's going to do all this. All we need to do is pray. We don't need to go out there and work. We don't need to be out there in the world. God's going to solve everything. All you need to do is pray. It's this very dispensationalist attitude, rather than we need to be in the world. We need to study the world. We believe right and wrong exists, and we need to be part of making the world a better place. And it's good for us, right? It's good for us to be part of making the world a better place. And God calls us to do it, not because God couldn't do it himself, but because God knows it's good for us to be part of making the world a better place and really putting it into practice. And there have been a lot of theologians who have really made me think about this. People like, Boyle, Father Gregory Boyle. He's a Jesuit priest in Los Angeles, where I'm from. He has a book, Tattoos on the Heart, just incredible book. Talks about really putting that stuff into practice, sort of things. At least a different interpretation of Christianity than it sounds like the one Drew was raised in. And then last but not least, this quote from Epictetus. I love this quote, and I know Drew likes Epictetus, so I'm sure if he's watching this, he'd get a kick out of this. We cry to God Almighty. How can we escape this agony? Fool, don't you have hands? Or could it be God forgot to give you a pair? Sit and pray your nose doesn't run, or rather just wipe your nose and stop seeking a scapegoat. And this is once again going on to this other point, right? If we see that there are problems in the world and we're Christians, we don't have to pray and expect God to solve them for us. God also gives us the tools to be an active part of solving the problems that we see in the world, and that's good for us to do. It's not just enough to just sit there and pray. We also need to do. And I think there are a lot of Christians failing at this. But and I think it's very fair for someone who's a skeptic or who's an atheist to look at Christian communities who are doing this and point a finger at them and say, what are you guys actually doing? You claim you believe all this stuff, but you're not living it out. They're going to inform their view of Christianity and the merits of Christianity on the basis of people who are sitting around and not living it out, who are sitting around there and honestly not doing anything. That's really harsh, but to them, not doing anything. And I think that's a fair, maybe not fair, but it would be fair to look at some Christians and have a problem with that. Because I look at some Christians and I have a problem with those Christians that don't think they need to take an active role into making the world a better place. But that's my own theological view. And I don't mean to sound judgmental. I really don't. I think I've been in there and I've wondered, does this Christianity stuff really add anything? And we need to ask ourselves this question. What does Christianity really add to my worldview? And if the answer is nothing, we need to really reevaluate what we're doing. Is it causing me to go out there and help the poor and do all these things like Jesus talked about? And if the answer is no, I don't know. If it doesn't have an impact in your life, is it really fair to call yourself a Christian? I don't know. I'm not the one to say. But for me, it's not much. And James talks about this too. James even mentions, anyone who calls himself religious but does not bridle his tongue and deceives his heart, his religion is worthless. Very interesting. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you have any comments or stuff, let me know in the comments. Let me know what you think, and I'll try to get back to you. Yeah, thanks. See you in the next video.